Well, you were in Wapping, weren't you, when you were?
Yes. So when I joined the Times, it was in the old rum store in the main Wapping complex, and then we moved to this slightly newer building, which was just on the highway, but it was still all at Wapping when I was at the time.
So you never got the Shard?
I never got the joys of the Shard. No.
But in politics, we were thinking you are really the great survivor. You've been through so many cabinets. Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I don't know whether it's good fortune or a curse. But I think it's... you can never in politics know how your career is going to take shape, because so much of it depends on contingency. And so Jack Straw, I think, was the one person, maybe Alistair Darling as well, who had been, and Gordon Brown, who'd been in the Labour cabinet from the beginning to the end. Those 13 years have been very different from these 14 years in that we've had slightly more prime ministers. And so there've been more changes. So I don't know. I think that there's no single reason. I think that there have been different relationships with different prime ministers and different political events that have meant that at different times I've served a purpose for each of them.
There's no job that you still want to do then?
Well, I can't think of any job that I would still want to do now other than carrying on with the one I've got. So a while back, obviously when I was on the backbenches after Boris made his deliberations, and obviously during the time that Liz was Prime Minister, I thought then that would be the end, that I would never be in cabinet or in government again. I was quite looking forward to doing other things, but then when Rishi became Prime Minister, he asked me to come back, and I was pleased to be able to come back to doing the job that I was doing, because I still felt there was lots of unfinished business there. So it's often remarked that you need to be in a government department for at least 2 years before you feel that you're making a decisive difference, and I think that's probably true. Those jobs, particularly when I was at the Ministry of Justice, which I wasn't able to do for that length of time as a minimum, were areas where I've got the sort of biggest regrets about work undone. So whether or not people will end up agreeing with or supporting what I'm doing or what I've done, at least I feel that, God willing, that I'll have a relatively clear run and we'll be able to say, well, we had sufficient time to make a positive difference.
And do you think your background makes you more determined, more ruthless, or more empathetic? And Tony Blair, when we talked to him, said he thought it was a spur to ambition, having some kind of tough...
Yes, I know, and I mean there are lots of things, aren't there? So there's this wonderful book, The Fiery Chariot, about the number of people who've gone on to take leadership positions in politics who've lost a parent early in their lives. I didn't lose a parent per se, but I wonder if there are at least two ways in which my background has an impact on me. One is, if one is adopted, when you are adopted, there is the sense of gratitude that you have that someone has chosen you, and so therefore you feel an obligation on some level to prove that they didn't make a mistake, that their gamble on taking you into their life and the love and care that they invest in you wasn't wasted. So very much in my mind has always been the thought that you need to demonstrate that you are giving something back or justifying the risks that they took. I think that is definitely one thing. And then the other thing about being adopted is that you're aware of, I mentioned chance and contingency earlier, you're aware of how different things might have been. And I think I've mentioned in a different context that if I'd been adopted by a different family at a different point, then the opportunities I might have had in education and elsewhere might never have arisen.
And you were born Graham Andrew Logan in Aberdeen in 1967, and you were adopted by Ernest and Christine Gove.
Yes.
It's extraordinary in itself just to change your name. But also, can you remember anything sort of at all from the very early years? Do you remember before you knew you were adopted?
No, I don't. No. And in fact, I had always imagined that I'd been born, or I was told that I'd been born in Edinburgh. My mother, my birth mother, came from Edinburgh. She was a student. She was studying cookery in the hope of becoming a cookery demonstrator in Aberdeen when I was born. And it was only thanks to the work of a guy who was writing a book about me, who tracked down my original birth certificate, that he established that I was born in Aberdeen. After having been born, I was then looked after. I was in care, and the adoption agency that placed me with my mum and dad was based in Edinburgh. So they went down to Edinburgh to collect me. That was when I was 4 months old.
Did you come with anything at all?
No. So I was, they visited Edinburgh, they collected me, took me back to Aberdeen. This was just before Christmas in 1967. I don't remember a thing. My earliest memories are of Aberdeen, my parents, the house that we were living in at the time. It was only when I was older that my mother explained to me the circumstances of my coming to be their son.
And what did you feel when she said that? How did she explain it to you?
Well, she explained that unlike other children, that I hadn't been born to them. And she had a phrase which, again, I always carry with me, which is that you didn't grow under my heart, you grew in it. And at the time when you're a child, you're aware that there's a difference, but the material, the everyday, the ordinary circumstances of my life were very similar to the other boys and girls in the school that I was attending at the time. So it wasn't the case that...
That's such a lovely way of describing it.
Well, again, it's difficult, I think, for any parent to explain to a child when they're different, where that difference comes from. But in my mum's case, she wanted to emphasise that this was not something that should be seen as traumatic or, concerning or whatever. And I don't remember feeling uncomfortable about it. It was a fact. Other children, not aware of any others in the class I was in at primary school, but other children were adopted as well. And so it's obviously had an impact and an influence on me as I've reflected on it throughout life. But at the time, it didn't seem disorientating.
And what was your house like?
Well, the first house that we lived in was essentially it was a flat, ground floor flat in a sort of terraced street in Aberdeen, number 7 Erskine Street. And it was, so obviously my first memories are of the early 1970s. It was warm, comfortable, loving. I remember certain things about it which now seem unimaginably distant. The fact that we had a mangle in the back garden, or in the sort of room towards the back garden, for drying clothes before they were then hung out. So it's a different time. I remember we had a coal fire as well, but it was a very warm and comfortable home, a very loving home. My sister, who was also adopted, Angela, arrived with us when I was 5. I remember her being bathed in a metal bath in front of the fire just after she arrived. And we moved when I was about 8 or 9 to a different house, to a bungalow, semi-detached bungalow, in a different part of Aberdeen, about sort of 10 or 15 minutes walk away from where I'd been. That house move also meant that I moved from one primary school, Sunnybank Primary School in Aberdeen, to another, Kitty Brewster.
So was money quite tight? Did you have a sense of things being difficult, or you didn't feel like
I didn't at all, no. My dad's business ran into difficulties later on in my teenage years, but when I was growing up, no. So everything was, compared to the other boys and girls in my school, broadly equivalent. So I went to primary school with my neighbours in that street and others around, and I don't remember anything. We didn't go abroad on holiday until I was 11, but I don't think that was particularly atypical for boys and girls from from 70s Scotland. So no, I don't remember anything that could be regarded as discomfort or hardship or anything like that. Not at all.
What was the first holiday you went on abroad?
The first holiday we went on abroad was to Crete. So it was just before I went to secondary school, it was the second time I'd been in a plane. The first time I'd been in a plane was when I was just 4 to visit my aunt who lives in Detroit in Michigan. So that was actually the first time we went abroad. But this was the first non-family visit, but pure holiday visit. So we went to Crete for a week. I remember the heat more than anything else.
On your Scottish skin.
Exactly. That was the overwhelming sense of it. And also I remember what it was like being able to swim outside. I mean, obviously, in Aberdeen, you're by the coast. Swimming in the sea then is quite a challenge. But being able to swim outside in a swimming pool in the place that we were staying was, again, I was, it was 1978 or so, at 11 at the time. It wasn't a revolutionary experience, but it was certainly another sort of, widening of the horizon.
And how Scottish was your family? Did you wear a kilt and have kippers for breakfast?
Not all the time. There is a picture of me when I was 4 on the trip to see my auntie in Detroit. And I wore the kilt. My mum and dad put me in a little kilt at the time for the journey, which I think was probably calculated, A, to delight my auntie, because she had moved from Scotland to America, and B, to make sure that we got preferential treatment on the flight.
Did you like it?
But no, from that moment on, until, funnily enough, I was at university, I never wore a kilt. No, but the thing about Aberdeen is it's a city which has its own defined identity. I think anyone who spends all their formative years in one place will have a particular affection for it. But Aberdeen is and indeed the whole northeast of Scotland. It's a place where people tend to be undemonstrative. So it's there is a sense of different types of Scottish characteristics. So on the one hand, there's the sense of garrulousness, hospitality, conviviality. On the other hand, there's an aspect of the Scottish character which is douce, reticent, which is more reserved, and the northeast of Scotland definitely is the latter. And then Aberdeen is a city of a particular size, which has, as it were, it's a city with everything in it. So university, hospital, prison, but also it's a world entire unto itself.
And do you think you're more reserved unless you're on the dance floor?
Yes.
And do you still go clubbing there?
Yes, though obviously to the chagrin of my special advisors and the interest of the media. I think I definitely feel more relaxed in Aberdeen than anywhere else, because anywhere where you've grown up, where the streets are more familiar, where you could almost be blindfolded and you could find your way back home, feels more reassuring. The other thing also is that when you're there, because home for anyone will have been the place where you will have had your first pint, gone to a pub for the first time, gone to a nightclub for the first time, and so on. It feels in a way, safer there than other places where you will have developed your career or met other friends or enjoyed other experiences.
And your father died recently. What impact did that have on you? And did it bring back all kinds of memories and a sense of kind of reconsideration of your childhood?
Yes. My dad had been ill for some time. He had adult onset diabetes, then heart trouble, and then in the final year or two of his life, he was increasingly housebound, and in the final couple of months, bedbound. And so as I visited him over that period, I could see the deterioration. My mum obviously was living with it every day, but the change was obviously more marked if you've been away for a month or two and then come back. And so I was conscious over the course of the last year or two that my without knowing when, that my dad's life was drawing to a close. So that inevitably makes you reflect on your own, mortality, and also on what you owe to your parents. As many people listening will know, when a friend or a relative is near the end of their life, they can rally. Hope comes to you. You think that, and you're anxious always for any sign from the doctor that they can come home, that they can have another week, month, a number of months when you can spend time with them. And I had gone back, and I was about to start work at the very beginning of the working year, been in Aberdeen over Christmas, and then got the call on the weekend just before I was due to go back to work, when I was had just returned to London from the doctor, and it was clear from his tone of voice, without him having to spell things out, that I needed to go back. And I got back on the very first flight that night, but I just missed my father dying because I was on the plane when he passed away. And I remember when I landed, text message from my sister saying, "Come to the hospital now," and I knew that he would have passed away. And then it's obviously we'd had conversations beforehand. I'd had conversations with my father, but not being there at that moment is, leaves you thinking about all the things that you might additionally have said.
Did you get to have any final conversations with him at all?
Yes. So again, I talked to my father about, in the run-up to what was inevitable, all sorts of things about, the impact that he'd had on me, and how grateful I was to him and to Mum. But there's always more that you can say. But I felt that even though I wasn't there at that moment, that I'd had the chance to talk to him about many of the things that mattered.
And did he tell you how proud he was of you?
Yeah, yes, but the thing that goes back to what I was saying earlier about both. I don't think it's unique to the northeast of Scotland, but for men of a certain age, for Scotsmen of a certain age, showing emotion is not the thing. And so there was a what's the word? A lack of effusiveness in the way in which my father, or men of his generation and his background, would express themselves. But yes, he was. I remember shortly after I got elected as an MP, my parents coming down to the House of Commons. It was the day of the Queen's Speech debate, and Tony Blair was opening the Queen's Speech debate for the government, and my parents were able to come along and watch. And I was trying to intervene, I think, on Tony Blair, not so much because I had an important political point to make, but just so that my mum and dad could see me asking the Prime Minister a question. So yes, I think they were, but I'm proud of them because I think that they made real sacrifices in order to help me. Because again, one of the things that you asked earlier was my childhood, in any way financially distressed or uncomfortable? Not at all. But one thing that my parents did do was that they stinted a little on themselves in order to be able to pay school fees to send me to an independent school. So I was at a fee-paying school after the age of 11. And they, I know, made... we're not talking about poverty, but they made financial sacrifices in order to make sure that I could benefit from that education.
And what was your relationship with your father like when you were growing up?
Well, it's always very difficult to characterise a relationship, because the intimate relationship that you have with your parents, you're aware of how other people are getting on with their, or not getting on with their mum and dad, but you don't have a sort of direct comparison. So I think there were several things. One is that some of my interests were different. So there's always the cuckoo in the nest phenomenon. There's always the sense that if you don't have the same literally the same genetic makeup as the people who are adopting you, how will you alter? How will you differ? And my dad was, among other things, a great, when he was younger, a great sportsman. He was a boxer, boxed for the army. He was a footballer. He had footballing trials, and carried on throughout his life, loving sport. I am by no means a natural athlete. Anyone who's seen me try to run will know that. I enjoy watching sport. I would watch football with my dad, but I wasn't by any means, the sporting heir. I wasn't Frank Lampard to his Harry Redknapp by any means. So, but what I did have was, from a relatively early age, my parents noticed that I was a very keen reader, and both my parents, my mum and dad, would every week take me to the local sort of principal sort of department store, which had a bookshop in it, give me my pocket money, and every week I would buy a new book. And they encouraged and nurtured that. And they also put up with, some of the other things some of the other enthusiasms that I pursued, which I'm sure any parent would have known were not necessarily going to be the sustained passions of my life, but everything from music to drama, they were always willing to indulge me and to support me.
And what about your sister Angela? What was your relationship like with her?
Well, the complicating factor was not so much that Angela was adopted, and adopted from a different birth mother, but early in Angela's life, my parents noticed that she wasn't responding as I had, as other children might. And she was then identified as being profoundly deaf, 97% deaf. So the biggest challenge for us as a family was adjusting to that. And that meant both my mother and I and my dad learning sign language as Angela went to primary school. And again, I think we all have different characters and different personalities. And Angela's characteristics are different from mine. She's more adventurous in some respects. She lives about 20 minutes away from my parents now in Aberdeenshire, in a town called Kintor. And we stay in touch. I see her whenever I go back to Aberdeen. We text and WhatsApp and email and message. And I hope it's a good relationship. But again, I think there's a difference because she's lived in Scotland all her life. Her husband and children, obviously, she has 3 children. Her eldest son's just finished university in Aberdeen. Their life has stayed there, and my life has altered as a result of moving to London, working in journalism in London, and then working in politics.
I remember at your wedding, one of your parents saying that they had 2 children, and one of them was normal and one of them was, I think they almost used the word freak, but it was a sense of that you were so extraordinary and so different, and Angela was the normal one. And I thought that was very sweet as a comment.
Yes, no. I think Angela is, normal is, it can both be a term of reassurance and also, certainly is for a parent. We all want a normal child, a normal childhood. Yes, I think the thing is that the fact that for my mum and dad, Angela was growing up in Aberdeen, living near Aberdeen, all the rest of it, and the fact that I went on this sort of literal journey, I think made it sort of odder. It was interesting as well, when my sister and her husband were at my wedding. I think they had a great time. And what was nice was, I had friends from a variety of different backgrounds. But Angela and Stuart, her husband, got on with everyone, enjoyed it.
And did you have a sense when you were growing up that you were different and a bit weird because you were so academic?
I think the as I've got older, I've been more and more aware of how weird I am.
You didn't realise you were a nerd at school?
I went to, I mentioned earlier, these 2 primary schools in Aberdeen, and there I didn't feel particularly as though I was an oddity in that I would, without wanting to romanticize it, play football in the street with my friends, and we'd have the same interests and the same sort of gossip and all the rest of it. But I was identified by one of the primary school teachers, a marvelous woman called Eileen Christie, as potentially having the academic wherewithal to benefit from going to the fee-paying school I went to, Robert Gordon's College. And I was, as I mentioned earlier, a voracious reader. So I was sort of aware that I was more bookish than average. But then when I went to Robert Gordon's, I was in an environment, certainly in the class that I was in, with lots of other specky boys. So in that sense, just as I was sort of realising as a kid that I was more academic-y, I then was in an environment that was more academic-y as well.
And socially, did you feel different to the other children? Did you feel that you had less money as a family, or that your parents had scrimped to get you there and they hadn't?
Not dramatically, no. Later on, when I was at school at Robert Gordon's College, my dad's business went through difficulties, and it was just at that time that I secured a scholarship. There was this particular scholarship that was offered to people midway almost through school, which helped to defray the fees and helped us through that. So no, again, I was very conscious that there were some families at the school who were leading or whose parents had very comfortable middle-class lives. But the thing is that Aberdeen is not a city of plutocrats. It's a city of, where, again, the wealth is understated. It's a city where middle-class professionals can have a very comfortable life. But there was nothing about my existence which made me feel as though I was, disadvantaged in any way.
And your dad was a fishmonger. Did you ever go and help him out at all?
Yes. So my dad's business was started by my grandfather. My grandfather established this business which involved him and then my father going to the fish market in Aberdeen, which was thriving at that time. Trawlers would come in. The crates of fish would be unloaded. There'd be one of those auctions that would be impenetrable to any listener unless they were intimately involved in the business and understood both the Aberdonian accent and dialect. Then the fish having been bought...
Can you give us some of the dialect?
Fw's yoursel, Alice. You're an awful fine-looking quine.
You might have to translate that.
Yes, that means, how are you, Alice? You're a beautiful young lady. But then take the fish, take it to be processed, gutted, smoked, and then sent on to either retail outlets or to the Ross Fishes of this world, where it would be turned into fish cakes, fish fingers, cod mornay in white sauce or whatever it might be. And I did go, and I hated it. I'm naturally clumsy. So my first attempt to gut fish involved there being far more of my blood than anything else. And being clumsy and operating in an environment where that clumsiness is exposed and being, as I was at the time, the boss's son, that not conducive to feeling this is a happy environment. So it was a small business. My dad, employed between 14 and 20 people, I think. And again, it was a business that was superseded by time and by events. So the fishing industry, of course, has been eclipsed in the country, in Scotland in particular. But also when it comes to things like fish processing, it's moved from being the small cottage industry that it was when my grandfather set up the business to something that's obviously carried on in a much more industrial scale now. Did
you ever go to see it all and see what it was like?
Oh, yes. No, and there were bits of it, actually. So I remember going with my dad in the evening. I mean, he would have to get up quite early in the morning. And in order to be at the harbour as the fish was landed. Then he'd work throughout the day, then come back for the evening meal, tea. Then he would sometimes take me back to his business where they were smoking the fish for, Kippers, Arbro Smokies, for Onward Dispatch. And there'd be a kiln, which was a sort of brickwork kiln, with wood shavings that he would set light to, and then the wood shavings would smoke the fish overnight as they were hanging on, the various sort of metal poles. And so there was something, what's the word? There was something romantic in a way about aspects of the business. So while it wasn't the case that I ever thought that would be my future, the fact that this was something that his grandfather had built, this was something that he believed in, and also this was something that was an all-consuming enterprise, was there was something touching about that.
And when did you decide to go to Oxford? Was there a particular teacher who
Yes.
pushed you? And was that a sense of escaping, if you like, from your background, or was it a sense of just going on an adventure?
I was persuaded to apply by my English teacher, a man called Mike Duncan, who went on to become the rector, head teacher of Dundee High School. He was a brilliant English teacher. He identified my potential in that area. There were a group of us in my year who were encouraged to apply. Every year my school tried to send 3 or 4, normally succeeded in getting 1 or 2 boys, it was all boys at that time, to Oxford. And I applied alongside a few others. One, a chap called Duncan Gray, also succeeded in reading classics. He went on to work for Channel 4 and became the producer of The Big Breakfast, and then a head of light entertainment at ITV. Another, Rupert McNeill, went on to become head of HR at the Cabinet Office, where I ended up working with
Boris Johnson must have been contemporary, wasn't
yes.
he?
Well, Rupert's moved on since then. And then I got in to read English at Lady Margaret Hall.
Can you remember the interview at all?
Yes, I can. I remember in particular I was interviewed. The second choice college was Corpus Christi, Oxford. I remember being interviewed by a very fearsome English tutor called Valentine Cunningham, and his first question was, "What is Hamlet about?" And I said, "Well, it's about a Danish prince." And he said, "No. Wouldn't you say it was about Protestantism?" And then so I had to think on my feet. Anyway, I didn't get in there. But I do remember that the person who interviewed me at LMH was a very nice man called Nick Shrimpton, who was, funnily enough, and this may have had something to do with it, one of the few dons at Oxford to believe that Margaret Thatcher should have had an honorary degree in the 1980s. So I remember that he asked me a series of questions about George Eliot and Middlemarch. At that time, there was something called the Scottish Scheme, which meant that because hires and A-levels are different, you could apply on the basis of your hires, i.e. the equivalent of sort of fourth-term entry in old-fashioned Oxbridge speak. And then on the basis of that and the interview you could get in, that wasn't enough. So I then sat the entrance exam, and I remember getting the telephone call, I think it was just before Christmas, in 1984. And getting in, and I was delighted. And I don't think it was so much a sense of escape as just a sense of adventure. You're right. Most of my contemporaries went on to read law, medicine, and most of them were at universities in Scotland. I had thought initially when I was a boy that I wanted to be a doctor, and it was only later that, being particularly interested in English and history.
Is it the blood from the fish?
The blood? No. Never got to that
You weren't
stage.
very good at gutting it. May not be a good profession.
It's just as well I never became a surgeon. That is certainly true. But it was a mixture of actually loving English and history and wanting to study those subjects that really impelled me. The other thing that I really enjoyed at school was debating, and so that was also a component. And the teacher whom I mentioned earlier, who encouraged me to apply for Oxford, was also the teacher who was in charge of the debating society.
Were you already quite right wing or not?
No, when I was 16 or thereabouts, just before actually, we had a school election mirroring the 1983 election, and I was the Labour candidate. I came bottom, but I was a member of the Labour Party. You could join the Labour Party at 16 at that point. I was a member of the Labour Party for a year in 1983.
So at Oxford, you got in with quite a posh set. Was that deliberate, or was that, why was that?
Well, I think that the range of friends that I had at Oxford was, diverse, I think it's probably fair to say, but not necessarily in the way that it might be used now. So there were some people who were, are friends who came from, quite privileged backgrounds. I'm not suggesting dukes and earls, but relatively privileged. But it was also the case that there were friends of mine from, with whom I was studying English and with whom I had sort of, political conversations and so on, who came from different backgrounds. So I don't want to ruin anyone's career, but one of my friends at Oxford was Gary Gibbon, and he came from, if anything, a sort of similar background to mine. He was born in northwest London, went to a fee-paying school after the age of 11, but there was nothing sort of grand about his background. Another friend of mine from the same time, Anthony Fries, was again from Glasgow, but not from a stellar background, but also around at the same time, though I didn't know him at the time, was David Cameron. Also around at the same time, though I did know him, was Boris Johnson.
And did you want to be in the Bullingdon Club or not?
No. I was not interested in the Bullingdon Club.
And why not?
I think it seemed unimaginably distant. To be fair, I was less aware of its existence when I was a student than I was aware of the existence of another equally, controversial student organisation, the Piers Gaveston Society. Anyway, there were all of these student organisations that seemed to be, essentially devoted entirely to self-indulgence. I wouldn't say that I was a stranger to self-indulgence when I was a student, but the things that I was more interested in, debating, getting to know the world, political discussion and all the rest of it. I don't want to give the impression that I was somehow some sort of ascetic Bertrand Russell figure. Absolutely not. But it was also the case that these things were happening at the periphery of most students' experience of Oxford.
Can you remember the first time you met Boris Johnson?
I can. Everyone who wanted to join the Oxford Union, or every college rather, took its undergraduates round so they could see the facilities. Did they want to take part? Blah. And I remember in the bar of the Oxford Union, Boris was there, and he was one of the people. He'd been a senior figure in the Oxford Union. He was running for president. He was one of the people there to explain to the freshers what was involved. So I remember the shock of blonde hair, and I remember, as far as I remember, he was wearing a sports jacket, chinos, and penny loafers. And I also remember chatting to him briefly about politics, and he explained that he was a Tory, and I said, "What sort of Tory are you?" And he said, "I'm a Green Conservative."
And what about drugs? Do you think politicians should be able to be more honest about that? Did you take them at Oxford?
Yes, I did, but I think we've passed a stage now where I think there was fierce interest. In fact, I know there was fierce interest, obviously, at the time of, first of all, William Hague, or rather Anne Widdecombe, saying that the penalty for drug taking should be higher when William was leader. And then there was fierce interest when David Cameron was running for Conservative leader, because both things reflected generational change. I can't remember who it was who used the phrase, whether it was Tony Blair or Keir Starmer or someone, about a normal undergraduate or a normal student experience. I wouldn't want to normalise drug taking, but I think that quite the opposite, actually. But I think that it was a feature of the student experience for a lot of people. I think, again, without wanting to sort of get too much into the policy of it, I think that the type of cannabis marijuana that is available now will often have a far higher THC content a far higher capacity to cause harm. I'm not suggesting it was all right in our day and it's bad now.
What you're saying is you didn't get very high.
No.
Or you didn't inhale very much.
No. But the other thing also is that I think that the evidence about the link between smoking too much or ingesting cannabinoids too heavily and mental illness and psychosis and so on is more pronounced. These are difficult areas for any politician because you don't want to be accused of hypocrisy, but I think you do need to be honest about some of the risks that young people, in fact anyone, can face now.
Were your parents religious, or were they sort of more moral? Or what was the sense?
My mother is religious. She is a regular attendee at the Church of Scotland. My father was not religious, and I would think that insofar as I imbibed a morality from them, it was more from their example than anything else. So my dad, again, both my parents were not showy people, but as I look back on it, and in particular as I look back on my dad's life towards the end, I realised that to a significant extent he'd lived for others. He didn't necessarily want to take on my grandfather's business. He was quite a talented artist, and he was thinking, I know, obviously long before I was born, about whether or not he should do it, but he decided that he should out of a sense of duty to my grandfather, and also because for some time two of his siblings worked in the business as well. And then both my mum and dad's decision to adopt me and Angela, the fact that my mum and dad, took steps to support me at school and made sacrifices for themselves, I realised now, I think I sort of instinctively realised it throughout, but I particularly realised it later on, that they had, again, I don't want to suggest they were martyrs, they had fun in life. My mum still does. But they were thinking of others constantly, and so that example weighs with me.
And did you ever try to find your birth mother, or would you? Or would that feel like almost a betrayal of your adopted mother?
I've always found it difficult because I'm naturally nosy. And
you're a journalist by trade.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I've also felt that it is, even though my mum had said it wouldn't be an issue, I've always felt that trying to trace my birth mother would make it seem to my mum as though there was somehow something missing in our relationship. Funnily enough, just the other day, I came across a copy of a book by Polly Toynbee, in which she writes about the experience of different people finding their birth parents. I haven't read it yet, but I do also remember the radio presenter Nicky Campbell, who's written himself about his search for his birth mother, saying that it was something that he felt when we were chatting, he's adopted, of course, that was the right thing to do, but I haven't ever felt able to do it, actually, no.
Are you surprised your birth mother hasn't tried to find you?
There are rules that govern the type of contact that any birth mother or birth parent can have with an adopted child. So I think that this is one of the sort of great difficulties, because if you are giving up a child for adoption, you're acknowledging that while you may know about aspects of their future life, you can't make contact with them. And that is obviously incredibly difficult.
And do genetics matter, do you think? I mean, when you look at it now, do you feel you've got a lot of your parents' traits in you?
Well, they must matter. And I think the balance between the things that you adopt from your parents and the things that are there as a result of the DNA and the genetics. You can't know. Most scientists would say that it's that nature is more important than nurture. That the DNA dictates so much of it. Obviously, dictates hair color, eye color, everything. But I don't think I would be the person that I am, for good or ill, if it hadn't been for my mum and dad and the love they gave and the example they set, and those parts of me that are different. There's a curiosity, and of course the curiosity is magnified in looking at my own children now.
Yes, do you see things in them that you think might have come from your birth parents?
Possibly. The thing is that,
They're sporty.
yes. So both of them are sporty. My daughter, I know that every father will say this, my daughter is much more good looking than you'd expect any daughter of Michael Gove to be. She's got lots of beautiful aspects from my ex-wife, but you wonder sometimes about it. So yes, and my son Will is energetic, athletic, and again you wonder where that comes from. So to be fair, his grandfather, Sarah's father, was very sporty when he was younger.
And do you know who your birth father was?
No, I know nothing about my birth father.
All.
All I know is that my birth mother, as I say, was trained to be a cookery demonstrator in Aberdeen when I was born. And that's more or less it.
And did you have any sense, or have you ever had any sense of abandonment? So you spoke about your gratitude towards your adopted parents. What about, is there any sense of abandonment or
not consciously, but unconsciously there must be. So there are certain traits that children who have been adopted apparently manifest later. And these traits are not unique to children who've been adopted, but it comes back to attachment. So I was thinking about it because my son's currently doing his psychology A level, and we were discussing this in the context of the fact that Bowlby, the father of attachment theory, is one of the people he's had to mug up on. The physical relationship between a mother and child in the first few weeks and months matters a huge amount. And without that, there is something missing. Now, the impact can be minimal or maximal. But what it does mean is there can sometimes subsequently be on the one hand, because of that lack of attachment, because of that primal, early feeling of rejection, that means that there can subsequently be a later fear of commitment. Because if you, and this is all in the subconscious, this is all, there, not quite in the academic literature, but generally, if you've had that original early feeling of abandonment, then you worry about throwing all of yourself into something later because of the fear that if you make a total commitment, that you'll face abandonment or rejection again.
And do you think you did have a fear of rejection?
Well, you can't psychoanalyze yourself. So,
have you had any therapy at all?
No. I haven't had hypnotherapy to deal with my fear of flying, but it is an open question because I don't know the extent to which all of my manifold character defects are down to things that happened very early in my life, or other extraneous factors as well. I find it fascinating, but I also find it very difficult to exercise objective judgment about myself, because you need to be a professional. You need to be a professional psychotherapist or someone steeped in the literature to be able to disentangle all of the different influences and impacts that may bear on why someone is the way they are.
What about your politics? Because I think it's really fascinating all the way through. You've been passionate about the lost boys.
Yes.
So at education, then at justice, now levelling up. Is that because you are sort of a lost boy at one level in your mind, consciously or subconsciously?
It's because I was very much aware that I could have been. So I don't consider myself to be a lost boy, but I do think that I remember when I was shadow education spokesman, looking at a school in Liverpool, in Speke, where only one child got 5 good GCSEs in the whole of that year. And I know it might seem like a sort of odd thing to do, but the distance of that school from Edinburgh, I think, was the distance of Aberdeen to Edinburgh. So I just thought, if my life had literally taken a different course, that might have been the environment that I ended up. What would it have been like in that environment? Similarly, if I hadn't had loving parents, what would it have been like growing up in an environment where you have to put up with neglect or abuse, or you're seeing your parents not just rowing, but with domestic violence, and that those things can have a scarring effect, and that you can have people who've got amazing potential who, because of those circumstances early in life, are almost predetermined to go off the rails. And so in my mind was the thought that I had been lucky, that intervention can transform people's lives, and that if we do the right things as a society, then the potential of so many more people can be fulfilled. But more to the point, the misery that they face, and which can sometimes be visited on others as a result of their falling through the cracks, that misery can be alleviated or prevented.
And do you think it's helped that you feel to a certain extent an outsider and you feel slightly different rather than part of the establishment and part of the Bullingdon Club? Almost
everyone would say that they feel, almost everyone who's in politics says they feel an outsider to an extent. So even people who've enjoyed, so even though he would never say it, I don't think he has, Boris feels himself a bit of an outsider, but to the outside world, it would seem as though, Eton, Balliol, all the rest of it, would give him quintessential insider criteria.
But he also had quite a traumatic childhood.
Oh, he did.
His mother was in a psychiatric institution.
Exactly.
In many ways, you were more privileged, in a sense, because you had the happy childhood.
Yes, I was going to say that I think, again, only an expert can know how all of these things occur, but it's clearly the case that it must have had an impact on Boris when his mum, who he clearly loved, was, as you say, undergoing treatment for mental ill health at a very early stage in his life. But on the question of me, I feel privileged now, exceptionally privileged. I think that there are always perspectives that one can bring to bear by being slightly athwart or at some distance from other groups. So there was a lot of talk when I was in David Cameron's government about the Notting Hill set. And I think that it was unfair because it was an attempt to homogenise the experience of different people. And you both know and have seen David Cameron and George Osborne operating. And even though they are friends and a formidable political alliance, they're different.
In what way, do you think?
George is more Quicksilver, urban, in some respects more European. He is the sort of person who has his everything from his taste for opera, and indeed Bodnot, through to the nature of his conversation. One of the people he reminds me of in a way is sort of George Weidenfeld. He's got this range and depth of interest, but also the speed and mischief as well. David is a much more, what's the word? Even though he was a modernizer, he's much more of a traditionalist. So he's someone who is much more, he's much happier in a rural environment. I'm not suggesting that he's a hayseed, but he's someone who exudes less nervous energy than George. He has a calmness in demeanour that makes you think of, the heroes of traditional English novels and so on. So there is a difference there, and I'm trying to think, which would be the author who would sum them up best. But all of that is a way of saying that within that group, and there were people with whom I worked and with whom I was friends. Maybe there was I'm sure there was a difference of experience, because without wanting to indulge in this sort of ridiculous hierarchy of privilege where, you get points, negative points for this or that, I think just having a slightly different experience to some of those there, and indeed a slightly different experience to some of the people around the cabinet table today, means that you you bring something to the conversation. But
you're
ultimately,
more Dickensian in some ways, aren't you? It's more of a extraordinary story.
I don't know. I don't know.
But is that also why you're a reformer, do you think? Because you are the most sort of restless reformer, probably, in the Conservative Party. Do you think that's why? Because it is this sense of creative destruction. You've got to do something.
Yes, I do think that you can't hang around. You've got to try to make a difference. You've got to try to make a positive difference. And so different people will have different swings. So David Cameron had a very strong sense of public service, and I remember him talking about his mum's role as a magistrate, and the various different people throughout his extended family who always believed in public service, who believed that with the good fortune that you can have in life, that there is something to give back. So I don't think it's unique to any particular background. However, as we mentioned earlier, the belief that care and love invested in my early life means that I have a responsibility to demonstrate that if I'm in a position to make a difference, that I use the time that I have to make a difference. It is you should do rather than be.
And the night of the Grenfell Tower, you lived very close to it, didn't you? Did that have a huge impact on you as well?
Yes, it did, yes. So I'd just been put back into government, but I used to live just around the corner from it. And a couple of days after the fire, I went to visit the site and was horrified. And the more that I learned about the circumstances which led up to the fire, the angrier I became about what happened. What at first seemed like a terrible tragedy is clear now was a crime. And again, because the head teacher at the school most affected was someone with whom I'd worked in the past, because my son went to a school where some of the families of who lived in Grenfell sent their own children, it brought it closer.
And do you feel frustrated that you've had to abandon the housing targets? And there is a danger, isn't there? A lot of MPs feel that the Tories are just going to alienate a whole generation over housing.
Yes, I think that the argument over housing has been, I think, not in the Times, but elsewhere oversimplified. So we haven't abandoned targets per se. I think that we have a range of reforms that will mean that we actually do build the houses the next generation needs.
Behind the back of the NIMBY Tory MPs?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, I don't like, for a variety of reasons, I don't like to use the phrase NIMBY. But the thing that I would say is the education, the environment, housing. So these are some of the policy areas where I've had the most time to wrestle with. They're all systems. By which I mean that there is not a simple lever that you can pull and then suddenly change comes. So in education, it was a combination of academies and free schools and more autonomy, systematic synthetic phonics and assessment and teach first and Ofsted and a new curriculum together that drove things forward. In the environment, it's not simply a matter of targets, it's also a matter of the right subsidies for people who are doing the right thing, the creation of different types of landscape which provide an opportunity for regeneration to occur. And in housing, it's not just targets, it's also making sure that new homes are beautiful, that you've got the infrastructure that you need, that people feel they've got democratic control over it. It's entirely understandable because politics is conflict and journalism is conflict as theatre, that people will try to say it's NIMBYs versus the next generation. But my own view is that while I recognise those tensions, I don't think that's the best way of characterising the debate.
But you may be best remembered really for stabbing Boris Johnson in the back and for your basically which side you took on Brexit. That will be the future questions asked by A-level politics students.
Sure.
So how do you feel about that now? Do you think you made the right decisions around that?
Yes. So I often turn over in my mind what the different choices. I still very firmly believe that it was the right decision to support Brexit. The events that followed in 2016 I've written about and talked about, and it's entirely understandable because it was a moment of high drama in British politics. So I can completely understand why people are interested in it. And one of the things that's interesting is that it was the theorising that went on at the time about motivation, and subsequently. I think that the best thing now is for history to make its judgment, both about Brexit and about Boris, and then, I've explained to the best of my ability broadly why I took the decisions that I did, and then people can look back and reflect on whether or not that was wrong, premature, unfair, however they might wish to characterise it.
You said that Boris cannot provide the leadership, but you basically were completely vindicated, weren't you, by his time as Prime Minister? I
will always say that historians should decide that, because I served alongside Boris almost all the time that he was Prime Minister. So I'm as complicit as anyone in those years, the things that we got right and the things that didn't go so right. I should bear responsibility. So I don't think I should criticise Boris over that. I want to remember the good things about everything that he achieved, as everyone knows.
And you want him back?
No, well, I think we've got the right person to be Prime Minister now. So, again, Boris was a formidable person in so many ways. And there were some things that he achieved, resolving the Brexit en passe. The sheer ball of energy that he was during the pandemic, and we wouldn't have been world leaders in vaccination had it not been for him. And then also, you don't need me, Vladimir Zelensky will point out that Boris was the staunchest ally that Ukraine had at its most perilous moment. So, in any assessment of Boris, I hope that people will take a rounded picture. And again, Lyndon Crosby always told us when we were going into election campaigns, you are participants, not commentators. And other people are well equipped to pass judgment. Maybe one day when I'm no longer in active politics, I can reflect and try and pass judgment, including on myself. But for the meantime, what I have to do is be conscious that others will pass judgment. I've got to do.
And it had a huge personal impact on you, both Brexit and that whole period of, as you say, high drama, and your marriage split, and quite a lot of your friendships broke up. What was that like? Was it worth it, do you think, in the end?
Well, I don't think that politicians should ever ask anyone for sympathy on the basis of the decisions that they've taken. We have to own the consequences of that. And again, when it comes to friendships and relationships, there is never a single cause. Politics has a pulverizing impact on families, and it can also place friendships under very great strain. And that's why when I see some other politicians being attacked, including politicians in other parties, I do feel a sense of sympathy for them, because I think that they're facing, in some respects, an unfair level of pressure, and those putting them under that pressure don't always realise what the impact might be on others. But as I say, I believe that the decisions that I made, particularly on Brexit, were right for this country, and the ramifications on a personal level are things that I have to bear, and it would be wrong to, ask anyone for sympathy.
Do you feel guilty, though, in a way that your parents gave up so much and then your children have had to sacrifice quite a lot, and your marriage? Do you feel in a way that, I mean, it sounds awful, but in a way it has been a lot about you?
Well, it's very difficult if you're any sort of politician. And there are other jobs and roles where you can, for your family, have them drawn into whatever drama you were involved in. So I think one should always try to protect others to an extent. And I think in my children's case, again, I want to safeguard and protect their privacy, but I think it's also the case that they've emerged as very happy and robust and wonderful people. I mean, that's far more to do with Sarah than me. But you can never really know the extent to which any of the challenges that those around you face are down to wholly down to the decisions you've made, or down to a sort of extraneous other factors. And again, it's not for me to judge how other people react to me, but what I would always want to do is to make sure that any criticism that was directed at me didn't bear on those close to me, because I've made these decisions for myself.
And the Tory MP Danny Kruger said recently that marriage between men and women was the only possible basis for a safe and successful society. Do you agree with him, or do you worry that the Tories are getting dragged into American-style culture wars?
I don't quite agree with Danny on that. I know what he was driving at, I mean, Danny's a friend, and I've got a lot of time and respect for him and his point of view, but I wouldn't take that view, because I think that it doesn't reflect the reality of how so many of us live our lives. But no, I don't think so. I mean, we're not American, and we never will be. And so it will always be the case that politicians and others will debate questions which touch on sensitive matters. There will always be an argument, even if it's reduced to dry technicalities, about what the state should do through the tax and benefit system to support particular types of family organisation. And people will bring to those debates their own perspectives and judgments about what's right for individuals and society. And I dislike it when an idea is put forward and someone says, you're trying to stoke culture wars here, or you're trying to import American values there. I think we owe the idea and the person putting it forward the merits of looking at it, the respect of looking at it on its own merits. I mean, I can understand why sometimes particular initiatives are depicted in that way, but I think it's part of respect for others is respecting the sincerity with which they put forward their views, and then if you disagree, disagreeing agreeably.
You used to say you'd be deeply unsuited to being Prime Minister, but
yes.
You're one of the very few ministers who's actually achieved a great amount and done a lot, and particularly education and justice, that you've got a very good track record. Why do you still feel that?
Well, I think the moment's passed if it ever really existed. And having seen how Rishi's handling being Prime Minister, and having seen some of the things up with which he has had to put, I'm glad it's him, not me.
Could you have done a better job than Liz Truss, do you think?
Well, long pause. No, I think, again, in the end, I felt the choice between Rishi and Liz was, it was better for Rishi to be Prime Minister than Liz, and that's how it turned out.
And do you still feel like an outsider, even though you're in the Cabinet and you've been Lord Chancellor, multiple Secretaries
Yes.
of State?
I think it would be preposterous for me to say that I was some sort of, desperate outcast who suddenly finds themselves around the Cabinet table by accident. But I don't think any of us sitting around the Cabinet table ever feel, gosh, this is natural, this is where I should be, I'm entirely at home. Almost anyone in politics, will feel at certain points a variety of imposter syndrome, or will feel, look, if I get things wrong, and I'm entirely capable of doing so, then I could be out of my ear. So I certainly think that some of my experiences bring a slightly different perspective, but I wouldn't say that I would characterise myself now as an outsider. No, I think that would be testing people's patience a bit.
And what will you most miss about not being in the Cabinet?
Well, making a difference. So the big privilege of politics is not, getting a seat at the coronation, amazing though it is. The big privilege is being able to make a difference. And so whether you're a constituency member of Parliament and you know that with the casework that you're doing or the campaigning that you do that someone's life can be made better, or if you are fortunate enough to be a minister, let alone to be in the cabinet, knowing that you can enact change that is beneficial, that's a wonderful feeling. So again, I freely admitted that I have made mistakes and got things wrong, but every so often, as last week when the international league tables on reading came out, and England was the best performing country in the Western world, just behind Russia, if you can believe Russia, Singapore and Hong Kong. It was an amazing feeling. That didn't happen just because of me. It happened even more because of what our teachers are doing and what my friend Nick Gibb was doing. I mean, he's the real hero of it. But to have been part of the team that was responsible for taking English schools from a lowly position in the international league tables to near the top, that's a great feeling. It's a great feeling because, not just because, hey, we're number 4. It's a great feeling because children are enjoying opportunities that they didn't before.
Looking back to yourself at primary school, loving reading,
yes.
What do you wish you'd known then that you know now about life?
I think it's difficult to. I think it's difficult for anyone to have, as it were, a privileged glimpse into the future or a privileged glimpse into how to live their lives. You have to make your own mistakes and learn from them. So I can't distill a particular lesson, cultural experience that you could transplant into the mind of a youngster that wasn't going to be learnt through experience. I think the one thing that I probably would have said is to my younger self, is particularly at university, you'll never have an opportunity to, or very unlikely to have an opportunity, to have as much time in the presence of great minds as this. So do go to lectures, do take advantage of the presence of the academics in your own subject and others. So, we are all now listening, in fact, at the moment we're taking part in, but we are all now listening to podcasts. We are all now following Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook, or whoever it might be. And that's because there's still this restless thirst to have someone to communicate new information and new knowledge in a way that is accessible and informative and entertaining. And to have had, as we did at university, your own mini versions of Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook in so many areas, and not to have taken advantage of that, I think that's probably the thing that I would have told my younger self to do.